morning, everyone. I've got 11 o'clock, so let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to the fourth installment of the Senior Leadership Insights series, sponsored by the Graduate School. This series was created and developed by a group of volunteers from the Graduate Board of Visitors, some of whom are joining us in the audience today. To make the most of our focused time together, I'll address a few logistics up front. We'll begin the conversation with 6 key questions that we ask each of our featured guests. And after that, we'll welcome your questions from the audience. So if you'd like to speak, you can use the raise hand option accessible through the reactions button in the lower right corner of your Zoom window. This session is being recorded, so if you prefer not to appear in the meeting like Dean McLean, please keep your video muted and share your questions in the chat. So with those details out of the way, I'd like now to briefly introduce Travis Dewalter, who is in the PhD program in Public Policy and Economics, who will be interviewing Mr. Temple today. Travis is past president of the campus-wide Graduate and Professional Student Council. He is also a former Air Force commander and an alumnus of the Graduate School's Emerging Leaders Institute. And he holds a master's degree in economics from Columbia University and an MBA from Penn State University, which are just a few highlights of his background today. Travis, I'll turn things over to you to introduce our special guest today, Mr. Ron Temple.
Thanks, Melissa, and thanks to all of you for joining us. This is the highlight of my week for sure. I have the great fortune of introducing to you all our distinguished guest, Ronald Temple. Ron is a managing director and co-head of multi-asset and head of U.S. equity at Lazard Asset Management. He joined Lazard in 2001 after putting together 10 years of global financial experience at different financial institutions like Deutsche Bank, Bank of America, and Fleet Financial Group. Ron has a master's in public policy from Harvard University and graduated magna cum laude with a BA in economics and public policy from Duke University. He is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the Economic Club of New York, and CFA Society New York. Ron is also a very active alum here at Duke. He is the current chair of the Graduate School's Board of Visitors and is the co-chair of the Duke University Talent Identification Program Advisory Board. Ron also served as a member of the Trinity Board of Visitors at Duke University, and he had his term of service from 2006 to 2012. And now we have the great fortune of him joining us for the next 30 minutes, where we hope to soak all of his wisdom up. Ron, thanks a lot for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Now, I think what I want to start out with is just understanding kind of your path, your journey. And the first thing that jumped out at me when I was reviewing your bio is how your formal education skews towards public policy. You have an MPP, your bachelor's degree includes a public policy degree, yet you find yourself, or we see you put together a 30-year career in finance. Help me understand those choices that you were making early on in your time that kind of led you down the path that you're on.
Yeah, so firstly, again, thanks for having me today. And I feel like, by the way, after your bio, Travis, I should be interviewing you, not the other way around. So it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm honored for the opportunity and have a deep affinity for Duke, all things Duke, but particularly the graduate programs at Duke. So it's great to be here. I would say in terms of the path, at an early age, I mean, even when I would think, well, I started really loving economics and policy. I think I was 10 or 11 years old when I started really getting engrossed in this. And I remember as a child, whenever I got the chance to go to Houston, which was 100 miles away from where I lived in a small town of 500 people with a flashing yellow light, no red light in town, you could easily drive through at 50 miles an hour and blink and miss it. It was exciting because I could get a copy of the Wall Street Journal if we went 100 miles away. And by the way, that was the closest Wall Street Journal. And so I'd always had this interest in the intersection of economics and policy. And over time, that interest evolved in different ways. But initially, I'd always thought I would wanted to go into policy. And so, whenever I was able to get involved in public policy at Duke, and this is before we had a Sanford school, it was just really thrilling to me because it was this great intersection. And so part of why I got an MPP is I was still imagining that I could find a way to work myself into policy. I figured out after my summer internship at the Office of Management and Budget in 1988 that maybe working in government wasn't where I wanted to be. But I had this vision, maybe I could work consulting for government, work for, say, a Price Waterhouse or someone like that. And over time, though, my interest kind of veered more and more toward the finance side. And actually, I've been really fortunate because the role I'm in now is one where I get to exercise exactly the parts of my brain that I'm most excited about, which is policy and finance. And again, I won't take you through every detail of it, but I started work at Lazard 20 years ago, and my job at the time was to be a banks analyst. I'd worked in financial institutions for 10 years, as you mentioned before. I'd worked in trading and sales and corporate strategy, corporate finance. And it was a great background to be able to then analyze companies, analyze their strategies, understand the risk they were taking to generate the profits they had. And being in that role from 2001 through 2006, 7, 8 at Lazard was invaluable because obviously the global financial crisis hit. And that's where kind of my macro background came in. That's where an understanding of public policy was invaluable. If you think about votes around the TARP, the Troubled Asset Program that was basically passed in 2008 after it failed initially. If you think about Dodd-Frank, it's rare that you find someone who's excited to read 1,200 pages of legislation, but that was right in my wheelhouse. So it's been a long meandering walk and a long meandering answer to your question, but it's actually worked out really well where I've ended up in a place where I couldn't be happier to wake up every day and go to my job.
I love that idea of a young Ron Temple going to Houston to get the Wall Street Journal. That's very amusing to me.
It screams nerd. It screams nerd, I know. Go ahead. So,
one thing that your bio doesn't mention is that you actually traded your first stock when you were 11 years old. Do you remember what that trade was?
Yeah, I bought Texaco. And yeah, I remember how many shares and I remember the price. And so, and with each birthday or Christmas, if there was any cash, I would literally, cobble together my $200 and call E.F. Hutton. Doesn't exist anymore. It's now part of Shearson, Lehman, American Express, which all became Citigroup. And I would call and buy my 7 shares of whatever. I mean, so this was my college savings plan, and God bless my parents for letting me do it because I had no clue what I was doing. but it worked out. Over time, I learned.
Yeah, but it sounds to me like that spark started very early for you. And so you were interested in kind of that synthesis or that intersection of public policy and economics and finance and trading. And so was your first job out of Harvard when you graduated with your MPP? Were you at a derivatives trading desk right away? How did that look?
No, I mean, actually, my first job was actually while I was in grad school. After the first semester, I would say I was somewhat a little disillusioned with the program because Duke had been so good. Sorry, Harvard. Duke's undergrad public policy was so good. And keep in mind, by the way, a lot of the Duke public policy instructors at the time, some of them I think are still there, Fritz Mayer, Helen Ladd, had come out of the Kennedy School. And the program was very rigorous. It was very disciplined. And at the end of the first semester, I was thinking to myself, have I made a mistake? I'd had 2 job offers out of undergrad. One was at Chase Manhattan. This is before it merged with JP Morgan, which would have been in corporate finance, would have been right in the wheelhouse of what I wanted to do in many ways. Another had been a totally different job. And I decided I should maybe get a part-time job. And it turned out there was a job posting for Bank of New England, which I don't list on my resume, but it's ultimately got absorbed into Fleet. Bank of New England was bankrupt, by the way, when I joined the firm. I don't recommend joining bankrupt companies, but it was a job in human resources. And the job was to do statistical analysis in the HR department for the affirmative action, equal employment opportunity aspect. And so basically it was a lot of developing statistical tests in spreadsheets for the bank. And that was my entree to the bank. And I have to say, by the way, one of the first pieces of advice I give anyone who's an undergrad or graduate student is if you know there's an industry you want to be in, or there's a field you want to be in, it's great if you can get into the exact job you want, but sometimes that's not really possible. And frankly, I would not have been equipped to land on a derivatives desk at that point. But if you get in the building, and I literally mean get in the company, get in the building, that can open doors. And by the way, HR is a great place to be because you see all the job openings. And so it actually worked out really well. And I worked through the last 3 semesters of my master's program, basically full time at the bank, and ultimately took on another consulting role for another financial institution. So I actually had 2 jobs while I was at the Kennedy School, and that's how I entered the financial sector.
So it sounds like you had kind of an idea of where you wanted to go, and you recognized the value of getting your foot in the door, so to speak, or getting in the building, as you say. What do you think is the value that your graduate training provided you? Like, what does graduate education give you as you're starting off your professional career that maybe you wouldn't get through an undergraduate program?
Well, I guess, first of all, I keep in mind an MPP, for those of you who aren't public policy majors or graduate students. I mean, to me, an MPP is an MBA for nonprofits and government, right? Effectively, instead of maximizing profit, you're maximizing output with a limited amount of capital. And you're trying to figure out how to deliver goods to the most people possible with a limited budget. And I think there were a lot of valuable lessons coming out of that, many of which, by the way, overlapped with the Duke undergraduate experience. I mean, I think it's strong communication skills. And by communication skills, I mean not just verbal, but also written. I think the ability to succinctly convey what the key messages are to a decision maker is a key part of a public policy program. Because if you think about it, if you're in government or a nonprofit, you only have limited bandwidth from leaders. And I do think it's just also, the ability to think strategically, to deconstruct problems. And that's part of what I loved about public policy so much as an undergrad and a grad student, is you might come into a situation with a view, and then you have to learn a lot about context and figure out what are the key moving parts. And by the way, this is very similar to being a stock analyst. And I'll never forget, for example, when I was at Duke in 1980s, in 1988, this was in the midst of the AIDS crisis. And one of our public policy projects or case studies was the question of whether they should require HIV testing for everyone going into hospitals. And so you might have a view at the time. This, again, we didn't know as much about HIV at the time. We had to learn about different tests for HIV. We had to learn about false positives, false negatives. And it was really an interesting process. And that's what you tend to get in these programs, is forcing you to think about real world problems and real world goals and how to get from here to those objectives in an analytical, hopefully non-ideological way. And that's, again, part of what I like about the public policy program at Duke and at Harvard, is we try to professionalize the decision-making and take some of the unfortunate emotion and ideology and even theocracy that seems to invade our politics these days out of the equation and make it purely analytical based on facts and data.
Yeah, it gave you another way to think about problems and maybe a unique method for solving things. Considering that, imagine that I'm working for Lazard now. I've got maybe 2 years under my belt, and I want you to kind of paint a picture of, like, what does my day look like? I wake up in the morning, and what am I doing?
It depends on the role, but I'll stick with the role I had coming in, and because I think this is a more common entry into asset management in general. And keep in mind, when I'm going to talk about asset management, there are a range of different types of asset management firms. I mean, everything from passive asset management, where it's all about low cost, high volume. They're quantitative managers who are much more focused on coding and processing massive amounts of data. And by the way, I should note, quantitative asset management has evolved outside of structured data to increasingly rely on trying to identify anomalies you can capitalize in unstructured data. And then there's the traditional kind of fundamental asset management, just basic security selection, the likes of a Peter Lynch, who ran Fidelity Magellan 30 years ago. And that's kind of the role I entered at Lazard, and what my team does now. And that job largely is, I think part of what makes it so interesting is it's an amalgamation of different roles. One of the things you do every day is you think about accounting. And by that, I don't mean you're literally looking at T accounts and trying to figure out liabilities versus assets or booking debits and credits, but instead you're thinking about looking at the overall picture of a company's financial health, looking at their statement of cash flow, their income statement, their balance sheet, and assessing whether they're generating enough capital to remain competitive, to keep reinvesting in their growth, et cetera. So there's an accounting element. There's a strategic consulting element, because you're constantly trying to evaluate the broader scope of the industry in which the company operates. You have to have a sense of what macroeconomic levers might affect their cash flow and profitability. You have to understand what strategic choices management is making and how those choices relate to the competition, how they relate to regulators, customers, suppliers. And then you have to piece all of that together to think, does the company have the right strategy? Are the financials aligning with that strategy? Is the cash flow following what I think it should follow? And then you ultimately have to make forecasts. And so there's a modeling perspective of saying, okay, based on what I know in terms of demand and supply for the goods and services this company produces and their inputs they consume, what is my forecast of revenue and expenses and profitability for the company in the years ahead? And very importantly, I think humility is critical to this job because no one can forecast all of this easily. There are certain things you just can't forecast. I mean, much like a weather forecaster might not have known we would have record rainfall in New York City yesterday. They knew there would be a lot, but they didn't know how much in half an hour. You have to basically figure out what can you predict with precision and what can you not predict with precision, and then put sensitivity bands around that to be able to understand the risk and reward you're taking when you make an investment. And by the way, that would apply to stocks primarily, but if you're thinking about bonds, there are certain aspects of this that are similar. And so I think it's an exciting job because, literally in your 20s, you could be sitting there interviewing the CEO of a Fortune 100 company, asking her about her strategic choices, who she's got in her team, the succession plans, and you really are thinking of yourself as if you were running the company and trying to, with a humble diplomatic approach, try to assess whether you think the company's on the right track and what they might need to do differently. And oh, by the way, the other aspect of all of this that's increasingly important is thinking about some factors that are considered historically to be exogenous variables or non-quantitative, such as environmental, social, and governance issues, thinking about how climate change could affect a company and the demand for their goods. And so there are a lot of aspects, and part of what's exciting about the job is you're using a lot of your brain in different ways to approach it every day, and that keeps it exciting.
Yeah, so you've got this big research component, it sounds like, to the job, which of course graduate students get training in that, in just droves. It sounds like there's a modeling component as well, which a lot of graduate students are equipped to do. I like this kind of soft skills of humility. Are there any other skills or experiences or kind of abilities beyond those that you think would make for a very successful analyst or whatever the position is in your career?
And by the way, I started with analyst because analysts, in many cases, we as a firm encourage analysts to stay career analysts. We really believe that staying in a sector makes you an expert. For example, our healthcare analyst has been covering healthcare for 25 years. So you can get a real edge, and the company management teams know your conversations are just different when you know the company as well as the CEO of the company might know it. But in many cases, people progress on to be a portfolio manager where they learn about a range of sectors. They can move to different roles. I would say from a skills perspective, if I think about entering the building, if you enter an asset management role, regardless of kind of which area of asset management you're going to be in, as long as you're on the investing side, I think some basic knowledge of accounting is a real positive. Just you don't want to come into the building and be competing with people from other schools who might have been finance majors and not know the basics of accounting. I do think understanding the basics of finance can be very helpful, and then maybe that means trying to get into a course at Fuqua while you're at Duke. Or, by the way, one thing I recommend to people is taking the CFA. Being a chartered financial analyst, it's 3 exams, and you learn in the process of those 3 exams, assuming you pass all 3, a lot of the basics that really equip you well to enter this job with the skills you've already gotten from your graduate education. One last thing I would note, unless you go into a really hardcore bleeding edge quantitative investing firm, this is not something where you need a PhD in mathematics. In fact, if you have a PhD in math, you might be really disappointed about how little of it you use in this role. And so, I do think it's a case where it's basic quantitative skills, it's communication skills, strategic analysis skills, but, other than certain specific sectors, for example, in healthcare, it could be great if you come in with a sciences background where you marry that up with some finance. But it is not a case where I would say you need to be extremely sophisticated in a niche area to be able to do this well.
Let's take a step back. I think this is a good shift in our conversation towards maybe some tips for students who are finishing up their graduate degrees. And I want you to put yourself, back in your shoes at Harvard. What do you wish you had done differently? What could have set you up for more success, or maybe made your trajectory a little easier or faster or whatever? What advice would you give yourself?
Yeah, I would say the first and foremost is take advantage of every opportunity you have in front of you at Duke. And I mean every opportunity. I mean, when I look back at graduate school in particular, one thing I wish I had done is spent more time and invested more time in creating a network. I mean, and that network might not be valuable to you right now. It might not be valuable to you in 2 or 3 years, but that network might end up being useful or valuable later on. And maybe you can be helpful to someone else through that network. And I do think it's really important to make as many connections with your classmates as possible, but not just in your own program. I would try to reach out to other programs that might be, think of them as adjacencies where there's some kind of Venn diagram overlap of expertise or relevance, and also with faculty members. I do find even today, on a regular basis, I reach out to people at Duke's development department and say, can you find me someone who can talk to me about X? And it's fantastic. Duke is very receptive to that. It's a great institution in terms of keeping you as part of the Duke family for the rest of your life. But even better if you had your own personal relationship and you just pick up the phone and know who you want to call and call them. And so I'd say number one is build that network with your classmates and the different people in the faculty. Number two, go to the basketball games, because later on in life, you're going to pay a lot of money to get into Cameron. So while you can get in, do it. StubHub is very expensive for Cameron if you haven't checked. And enjoy Durham. I mean, I think that's, it's funny, when I was in Durham from 1987 to 1990, it wasn't the same as it is now. So it's a great place to be. Take advantage of it, enjoy it. But again, I think, you want to be the ultimate intellectual sponge while you're at Duke and take advantage of everything that's there, because it is an amazing differentiated experience relative to, I think, almost any other school in the US.
It's really common to hear folks give advice to, network more. And I think for you, it just comes it's so second nature at this point. Who are we networking with, or what message am I sending, or what email, who do I target? How do I target them? And then what do I do after I've met with them? What am I asking them? I think what I'm hoping for is maybe a little playbook on what we can do to start out our network, and then it'll start snowballing, as you mentioned.
Yeah, it's funny because, by the way, I wouldn't consider myself a natural networker. That's why I wish I'd done it better. So I appreciate the flattery, but I guess what I would think of is be genuine. Try to be, again, as expansive as possible in terms of what interests you. And if there's a subject matter domain expertise that you think is really interesting, and again, particularly if there's some kind of overlap where you can make a connection, I would say that would probably be the starting point. So, for someone like me, I would want to be reaching out and making sure I know the faculty members as well as possible in anything to do with capital markets. But personally, I'm also very interested in international relations. I'm also interested in global public health issues. I'm interested in climate change. The hard part is they don't, these experts might not have the bandwidth to spend time with every student who cares about climate change, which I hope is every one of them. But, trying to find ways where there might be an overlap in what you're studying or where you think your career is going to be, and just trying to kind of make that connection. And maybe it's as simple as reaching out for a coffee and saying, hey, I'm planning a career in X and I've been studying Y that's related to X, and you seem to do something Z that looks really interesting. Can we meet for 20 minutes? I think you'll tend to find that people are pretty receptive as long as you can show them some tangible evidence of some interrelationship between what you're doing. And so I would suggest that. I would say, by the way, as someone who gets random emails from people who have university affiliations from Harvard or Duke, I'm not as big of a fan of the emails because I get over 1,000 emails a day, and I probably spend an hour and a half each day deleting emails to make sure I don't miss the ones I need to answer. So I think you really want to try to find some connection other than just the blind email. And again, while you're on campus, maybe you can try to practice honing in on your networking skills. And by the way, one of my colleagues always encouraged me years ago, make a list on a regular basis, make a list of 5 or 10 people you want to connect to, and then hold yourself accountable for doing it. And so if you're uncomfortable with this whole networking exercise, maybe this is a way at the end of each month to say, did I connect to those? Maybe it's 3 people or 5 people. And then if you didn't, make yourself do it the next month. Or if someone's just so intimidating, take them off the list until you're not intimidated. But definitely try to take advantage of those. And by the way, one last thing I'll say, I've always hated the word networking because when I think of networking, and I've probably even said it in this conversation, I don't like the idea of meeting someone so I can use them. So go into this not because you think they will be useful to you, but also try to find a way you might be useful to them, right? Try to, again, find that synergy, make it a two-way street because, people don't really have a lot of time to use if it's all one way. So again, that would be my advice there.
It's good advice. And it's often that graduate students are just trying to find that solution, and so what you're kind of asking us to do is don't focus on the solution, but focus on the connections and try to develop those relationships. So I want you now, Ron, to talk to the graduate students, and I'm going to have you give a couple pieces of advice. The first thing is, what can we do now to get us hired into a job? You know, imagine we got 1 or 2 years left in our graduate degree. What should we be doing now so that we look like a great hire? And then the second part of the question will be, what can we do to be like, not only get hired, but be a fantastic professional in the career? So the first one is, Ron, we need jobs. How do we get them?
Well, I guess I remember out of undergrad, I think I had 55 interviews on campus and 10 callbacks and got 2 offers. And as you think through that kind of filter, be open-minded about the jobs you might want to apply for. Be open-minded about the companies and the geography. I mean, my 2 job choices, one was in Memphis, one was in New York City. And trust me, the geography made a big difference in which one I was going to take. But I needed a job. My view is I got to get a job out of here. My parents are going to be really upset if they spend all this money and I don't get a job. So, and by the way, I also would like to have an income. So I think you have to be commercial. But you should also know what your passion is. I mean, again, it's one thing to say I've got to get a job, but you know, the other advice I give people, if you're fortunate enough to be at Duke for graduate school, you're in a much better place than 90x% of the rest of the population of people in your cohort from an age perspective, and that you've got a great credential. And so I do think employers want to know what your passion is, and you need to know what your passion is if you know. But I guess I'm also just recognizing for some people, they might think they know what their passion is. So I guess point number 1 would be try to get an internship where you think you have your passion, if that's a possibility. Take an unpaid internship, do whatever you have to do, get in the building and see if you like it. And by the way, when we hire people out of undergraduate or graduate programs, we typically want to have had them as interns because we want to know we've had that 10-week interview to see if you really like this job and to see if we really think you can do the job. So the internships are critical. Understanding your passion is important. I think being honest too about what your skill sets are and where you might need to continue enhancing your skill sets. I know, you know, the standard joke in an interview is, what are you bad at? And people say, I work too hard. You know, don't shovel that stuff. I mean, let's try to be honest with where you are and what you would need to learn, because I think employers really like humility and self-awareness. I think one of the things I still find difficult to find in the finance industry is self-awareness. I mean, people need to be much better at saying, here are the things I need to improve on, and here's evidence that I've actually gotten good at identifying where I need to improve and doing something about it. Sorry if I'm rambling on the different soft things again. I think a lot of this is soft. Again, in some cases, you'll be fortunate enough to have a very specific expertise that is in need from a company or an academic institution or other entity, and that's great. But I think when you're coming out in a world where you might have a specific area of research or a specific area of expertise, find ways to make that relevant to a broader range of potential employers to get yourself as many shots on goal as you can get for different jobs. And then one other thing, by the way, when you are trying to decide to work, I think the culture of where you go to work is incredibly important. I mean, making sure that it's a company that really does try to have a diverse workforce, making sure it's a company that focuses on the needs of the employees, not just the income statement. Because by the way, if they're smart, they'll recognize that usually your most valuable asset are your employees. And if you get the best employees and keep them happy, your income statement will work. And so I think you also want to make sure you really get that cultural fit, because the last thing you want to do is find a job where you think you love the subject matter, but you can't stand the culture you work in, because you're going to end up being unhappy and you're going to want to leave. So try to piece all that together. And I really hope you can thread that to something coherent after I just rambled through all of that.
We actually, Ron, we're coming up on time, but we have a question from one of the students, Shahrazad, if I pronounced your name right. Maybe you could come off mute and you could ask your question to Ron.
Hi, Ron. I'm Shahrazad. Just finished a graduate degree this August at Duke in the program in literature. And I'm somebody who also shares your passion for the intersection of economics, finance, and regulation. And so the question I actually want to ask is about the impact of the global financial crisis of 2008, the mortgage-backed securities crisis on asset management specifically. And I'm just sort of wondering, you know, what was that moment like for you? and how, especially in relation to regulation, has that impacted the kind of work that you do in asset management?
I'll never forget where I was when Lehman Brothers failed. It was incredible. I mean, it was probably, it's tough to say versus COVID, which one was harder in terms of work and trying to figure out how to piece this all together. I mean, this was literally a case where every weekend I was in the office, probably 7 days a week, just trying to figure out which financial institution was going to go bankrupt next, and then trying to piece together how they would all affect each other. I mean, and by the way, if I think about how it affected asset managers, at the worst of the financial crisis, people were concerned that Morgan Stanley wasn't going to survive. After Lehman, there was a question of would Merrill Lynch survive? And so you were starting to literally contemplate, could the global financial system crumble? And that was kind of, it was incredibly stressful, partly because the global financial system crumbling obviously has massive global economic implications. It has huge public policy implications. It has huge implications for humans. And by the way, one of the things that I always try to remind people of, in Wall Street and asset management, some people get obsessed with just piles of money, but all of that money is someone's retirement money. I mean, this is what people are going to pay for their kids to go to college with. It's what they're going to pay their down payment on a house with. And so I always try to take this back to the human element. And by the way, a lot of the work we do on economics, by the way, is also around topics like inequality and labor, who's getting paid, who's not getting paid. And so as I was going through the financial crisis, you start contemplating catastrophic meltdown was a real possibility. And then you kind of look at the intersection of politics and populism. And you might recall, again, when Congress voted down TARP, the stock market tanked that afternoon. It was down a tremendous amount because the investors were saying, oh my God, the government's not going to be there to backstop this. The public was saying, why are we bailing out Wall Street? And so you're kind of trying to understand how these things were all going to come together and what might happen. And so it was very complicated. One last thing, so I don't want to go on too long, is for a lot of asset managers, our clients pay us to take market risk and investment risk. They pay us to choose the right securities and the right asset allocation. What they don't pay us to take is risk related to operations or risk related to who our counterparty is. And so another aspect that I think changed how a lot of asset managers operated in the financial crisis was, for the first time, they actually had to worry about, will my prime broker actually be solvent? If I trade stock or bonds or currency with that bank, will they come through on the other side, or will actually there be a loss related to who I chose to trade with? And so I think it caused everyone to have to up their game quite a bit in terms of just diligence, where historically you just assumed everyone would be solvent. You assumed the regulators were taking care of it. It brought a lot more complexity to the role of managing an asset management firm. And I think it also made people aware, sorry, one last thing, that mean reversion is not a great investment strategy. There were other asset management firms I won't name where they kept buying stock in Lehman and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac all the way down to zero, because they were like, oh, we've been through these troubled times before, the stock will come back. It's really cheap relative to its peers. But they weren't doing the right kind of fundamental analysis to recognize that if you looked at Washington Mutual as a bank, their deposits were flying out of the door. They were highly reliant on hot money, as we call it. So high denomination certificates of deposit at high interest rates. And those people tend to know when a bank's in trouble and they pull their funds. And so if you were doing the work right, you could see Countrywide had problems. You could see Fannie Mae had problems. And I think for some people, they just said, well, it always traded at 15 times earnings. It's now at 8, I should buy more. And so, sorry, this is, again, there's so many aspects. The global financial crisis, we could do a few years together on this topic, but it was definitely life-changing. I personally want to put in a plug. I think Dodd-Frank was a great piece of legislation. Could it have been better? Of course, any 1,200-page piece of legislation can be better. But I'm very thankful that as we went through the pandemic in the last 18 months, that we had Dodd-Frank in place and our banking system was a lot more resilient. And one thing we weren't worried about was a catastrophic meltdown because we put better guardrails around those financial institutions. And by the way, I'm excited you're a literature major. My favorite classes at Duke undergrad were actually in literature. So anyway, I'll leave with that.
Thanks for your question, Shahrazad. And we're actually at time. I wish we had, Ron, thank you so much. I wish we had a whole day or a whole week with you. This has been such a fantastic conversation. I'm going to pass it over to Melissa now to kind of close things out, but thanks again, Ron.
Thank you. Thanks, Travis.
Thank you so much to you both for this fascinating interview. I think you can tell from the chat, which was heating up with even more questions. I think Travis is right. We could have kept Ron here all week with questions and engagement. If you are a graduate school student, keep an eye out for an opportunity to connect with Ron Temple in person in October, in late October, and you'll be getting some more details about that if you do still have more questions, which it looks like folks have. I want to thank everyone for joining us for the conversation today, and please look for our next event in this Senior Leadership Insight series, which will be on October 15th, featuring Dr. Bob Beckler, who is Chairman and CEO of TemperPak. Thank you again to Ron and Travis, and thank you all for joining us.